In today's hand history, we are up against a younger, very aggressive reg who I have played with before in the past. And we end up playing, I believe, a fairly interesting hand. So let's get started. It is big blind 2K. It folds to the button, and this young aggressive player raises to 4.5K. I have King of Hearts, Jack of Diamonds in the big blind on 25 big blinds effective, so with 50K in chips. As you can see, King Jack here is just a call on 25 bigs effective. However, it's even more of a call here because the previous orbit, this player limped the button in a fairly similar stack depth. He had about 45K. In this spot, I want to say the small blind had about 45K, so about 21 bigs, 22 bigs. And when he limped the previous orbit and now raises here, I think that kind of defines that he has two different ranges that how he approaches here. If we look at a 25 big blind theory range, looks like this. And as you can see, it does have some calls, but it's a very small percentage of calls. Most people here in 25 bigs effective just largely play a raise. On shorter effective, they do include a lot more limps though. As you can see on 15 bigs, there are a decent number of limps at 16%, and at 20 bigs on the button, there are about 11% limps. So the fact that he's willing to limp here in the past and is now raising, I think it strengthens his raising range, but only by a little bit. So theory here, pre-flop, is definitely just a call, and in-game I also called as well, but it is important to remember that I think he has a fairly strong overall range here. So when I call, pot size is 12K, and the flop is the Jack of Clubs, the Jack of Spades, and the 7 of Clubs. So Jack, Jack, 7, two-tone. So I flop top trips with a king kicker.
So not to nitpick, but didn't you also flip bottom trips? Just saying.
Obviously on this board texture, theory, I should just be pure checking this. I would be fairly surprised if there were any leads here beyond like 2% or something. And theory says, yep, pure check. Now, button here, I think they get a lot of options. They can definitely go small. They might have some checkbacks. I guess it's possible they have some larger bets, but I would guess in general they're supposed to bet small with a few checkbacks would be my assumption. Looks like they're checking back about 23% of the time and c-betting quarter pot 76% of the time. And that is what he does. He bets 2.5K into a pot size of 12K. And when he's betting this amount, I don't think it says too much about his range. I don't think he's going to upsize or downsize here relative to hand strength. So just based off of our pre-flop assumption of him having a stronger button opening range than what he normally would have, I think this is a great spot for us to just start pushing our value here. While I think trapping here is fine because he is young and aggressive, I also think that check raising here kind of represents a lot of just bricked hands. And with him being young and aggressive and having position, I think he's going to be fairly inclined to want to float versus me. So I check raise, but we're going to look at what I am supposed to do from a theory perspective. I assume I'm largely, yeah, exactly. I am just supposed to check raise my king jacks, my queen jacks, my jack tens. I guess my jack nines and jack eights, I get some trappy traps. Jack 7, I get traps. But largely, I flop a jack, I raise unless I flop a full house. With my jack 7s, and that's it. Now, the important part of this hand is actually what types of check raises I have on the flop, because that dictates kind of how a lot of my approach should occur on turns and rivers. So in this case, if we look at what types of hands I'm supposed to check raise, the main thing that stands out to me, and I hope should stand out to you as well, is look at all these 7x that I have as check raises. These are all very clearly value check raises. And I have pretty much every single 7 that I have, I check raise at very high frequencies. The only exceptions are, I guess, my flop full houses. Every other 7, I get a check raise. So I have a lot of check raises here. I'm check raising 39% of the time, which is kind of ridiculous. That is a very large percentage of hands to be check raising. I want to say the average check raise percentage on flop, even versus a button, is probably around 15% across all boards. So a 38% check raise, 23% above average is kind of ridiculous. But as you can see here, look at all my 7Xs. They want to check raise for two reasons. A, they're pushing good equity and they're going for value. And B, really importantly, they're also very vulnerable hands that want to get protection. So by check raising your 7X, you get a lot of value, but you also get a lot of protection. Keep this in mind because my approach to future streets is relative to the fact that I know I have a lot of 7X. So I check raise, he calls.
What Ryan forgot to tell you was what his check raise was to, which was in fact 7,500. Hand histories are hard.
And the turn is an offsuit deuce. Straight brick deuce. I, of course, want to keep betting for the most part, and I don't need to go very large either. Looks like I'm only going a quarter pot here. Pot size on the turn is 27K. Turn is a deuce, and I bet 8K or a little bit above a quarter pot. As you can see here, my king jack is either check trapping or going quarter pot. And look at all those 7X here. They're all pretty much just betting. They want to keep pushing their value and they want to keep getting protection. My Jack X, though, actually looks like I can have some traps with my strongest Jack X and then just keep betting on my weaker Jack X. The reason being that my stronger Jack X is going to have more check traps is because I block kings and queens with these Jack X, while the rest of my Jack X, I do not block his strongest hands. I also block his some of his double floats like ace king and ace queen, so blocking a lot of his strongest hands and not being able to win quite as big of pots. These are going to be really good check traps. Looks like my king jack, I should be check trapping it pretty often, but I don't have the flush draw blocker in my hand. So because of that, I wanted to keep barreling and building this pot and try to most likely set up a river jam. So I bet a quarter pot and he ends up calling. As we can see here, look at these ace high calls. He's making a lot of ace high calls. Aces, kings, queens are calling. So aces, kings, and queens are either calling or raising. So he definitely has a lot of hands going into the river that are only ace highs. He also has a lot of hands that are even, say, king high. So on the river, after he calls my turn bet, the river is an offsuit 10. So that flopped flush draw bricks out. So pot size on the river is 43K, and I have 30K in my stack. That's a pretty smooth jam. It is a really good option to shove. However, with my king jack, I do block pocket kings. I block hands like some of his king 10 type floats. I don't block clubs though. I don't block a lot of his other ace highs. I do think in general on the river that he has a lot of middling to weak hands that aren't necessarily going to be willing to call a jam. And he also has a decent number of hands that might be willing to turn into bluffs if I essentially sell that I have a 7 a lot. So let's look at theory and let's look at what 7s are supposed to do, because that was kind of like my thought process, is that on the river I get to have a lot of small bets. I guess my 7X doesn't really want to bet small. Some of my Jack X does. It looks like my main hands that kind of want to go small are some of my river to 10X, which makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's largely like river to 10X. I guess I do have a little 7X. So in my mind, when I bet the river small, I'm trying to sell to him as hard as possible, hey, I have a 7. Or maybe at best I have a 10. I do not have a jack. If I had a jack, wouldn't I just jam? And when I block bet, he tanks and folds and shows me ace queen, and said that my 7 was good. Which I guess in his mind, ace queen had too much showdown value to turn into a bluff. He also had the ace of the flush draw in his hand, so I block bet a quarter pot. I'm curious as what bluffs he's supposed to use. Yeah, king queen. That looks like ace queen with the queen of the flush draw blocker does shove. Ace queen with the ace of the flush draw blocker calls or folds some rare bluffs. Okay, no, I guess not too surprising. This is supposed to have a lot of jams versus me, it looks like. Largely it's jack X, aces, kings, queens, tens. I don't think he's going to find these aces, kings, and queens as jams, or like his strongest 10x. But I do think all of his other bluffs that are a lot more natural, I do think he will be able to find. And then on top of that, so my bet on the river accomplishes a couple different things. First, I get all of his hands that have a decent amount of showdown as auto calls. And then on top of that, versus this particular player who is very loose aggressive, I can also induce bluffs. There's a lot of players who I don't think are going to bluff jam here ever. I'm just going to shove myself to try to get them the most out of them. But versus a player that I think is very, very, very capable, I think it's can be a good play to bet small to induce. From a theory perspective, looks like my small bet with king jack isn't really a thing. I'm curious as if I do shove, what types of hands he is supposed to call. Looks like ace high does call occasionally, even if it does have the flush draw blocker. The upside of jamming is I polarize my range in his eyes, but that's why I'm going to shove versus a lot of players and not versus him, because to me the key point of my river decision is I believe this player in particular is capable of finding the types of bluffs, jams that I think he needs to have, and then maybe even finding a decent amount of extra bluff jams versus my small bet as well. And on that note, thank you very much for watching. Stay safe and healthy out there, and best of luck at the tables.